All right. Well, I mean, you edit all of it down anyway, don't you?
Yeah, basically. I mean, we're live right now. This is Mike Hattery. This is the Everybody Hates Cleveland podcast. I'm here with Adam Burke. He's as opinionated and as critical as I am, which is completely necessary. So we're gonna fire up the hot take machine tonight. I'm not sure where I'm gonna guide Adam. I haven't decided yet. So let's talk about rebound candidates because I'm gonna try and make this as optimistic as possible. And the most obvious rebound candidate is American hero, Twitter phenomenon, Jan Gomes. Um, over under 20 home runs, and why is Jan Gomes going to bounce back in 2016?
Well, first of all, Mike, thanks for having me. I appreciate your time here on this lovely Friday night. For Jan Gomes, I think you got to look under 20. I mean, 21 in 2014 was really nice. I think that may kind of be a high watermark for him, in large part because in terms of depth at the catching position, there aren't many teams that are better than the Indians. So you can afford to send Roberto Perez out there, a couple times a week to keep Jan Gomes fresh, to keep him healthy. I mean, you got to keep in mind here, this is a guy had a pretty serious knee injury last year, only played 95 games. So you kind of want to pace yourself with him. So I just don't think he'll have the plate appearances to get 20, but he should bounce back because, I mean, that knee injury, it wasn't just a catching issue and a balance issue with framing. It was also an issue with hitting in the batter's box and, being able to go out there and reach that outside corner. So I expect him to, improve. I mean, I don't know if he'll hit 278 again or have an OBP in the 315 range, but across the board, we should see improvement.
What a professional entrance. Gosh, I come in all casual and you come in with this really professional entrance. God, I'm going to have to overwrite that. Jesus. But no,
You need to
okay.
start
So,
over. Well, we can start the whole thing over. It's fine. Yeah, or either that or you need to drink more. Let's
no,
do
I'm
that.
just, yeah, whatever. I mean, ultimately, who cares what happens from this point on? But back to Gomes. What's ideal playing time wise? I think you touched on something really important. Is it 120 games? I mean, is the best thing for the Indians this year if Gomes just plays a good 120 games?
I think so. I think maybe you even err a little bit on the side of caution, maybe go 110 or 115. Another positive development that could come out of it is if you do use Roberto Perez for 50, 55, 60, even 60 games, which would probably be a worst case scenario because it means Gomes went in the DL. You could potentially increase his trade value in the offseason, and that could be something, of interest for the Indians, particularly because I mean, they may have Zimmer up here. Frazier probably still won't be ready yet, but we may still have some outfield concerns going into next year as well. And maybe you could use Perez to do that, or get a guy whose arm isn't going to fall off from overuse from Terry Francona, somebody to replace Brian Shaw. So I think it's also in the team's best interest to use Perez a little bit more and see if you can increase that trade value.
How close are we to starting to consider Roberto Perez as possibly a long-term option if Gomes never is Jan Gomes of 2014 again? And I know this is a conversation we don't really want to have, and I know that bounce backs are something you sort of want to expect, but are the Indians did we hold on to Roberto Perez to this offseason when he certainly had significant value because there's some substantive concern about what Jan Gomes is post 2015 injury?
Yeah, that is a valid point. I mean, the one thing that separates the Indians from a lot of teams in the American League, and I mean, I'm part of the sports betting industry, so I've seen all the season win totals, and you and I have talked about it before that there's so much parity in the American League. But the one thing that seems to separate the Indians is their depth, and the catching position is one area where they probably are the deepest in the American League, or at least very close to it. So, if Gomes does come out here and struggle, you can use Roberto Perez. I mean, Roberto Perez has the ideal backup catcher skill set. He walks, he's got power, he's not much of a downgrade defensively. That is a big strength. I mean, I guess I always talk about trading him in the sense that, the Indians, I mean, they can't go play in free agency. So, if there's somebody that has big time substantial trade value, then it has to be a consideration. But sure, I mean, I would if Jan Gomes comes out and struggles, I'm comfortable with Roberto Perez.
I think one of the interesting things is, would you would say Roberto Perez is the better defensive catcher now,
Uh,
or is it a coin flip?
I think you have to see Jan Gomes healthy again. I know the framing metrics came down. A lot of that for me was due to the knee injury. I think Gomes. I think that they're pretty even in terms of pop times, throwing down to second, throwing down to third, that type of thing. Maybe Gomes is a little bit better from a blocking standpoint, just because he knows the pitching staff a little bit more. But I would say that they're pretty even. I mean, but that being said, does Roberto Perez have more of a ceiling that we haven't seen yet? I think we've seen Jan Gomes's defensive ceiling. I don't know if we've seen Roberto Perez's.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things I really would like to see Roberto Perez in terms of holding up over a larger sample. I think one of the things that you can see with catchers, and especially really good defensive ones, is in small samples when their bodies are protected. I think they can look better than they are defensively at times, just because they're consistently healthy and not worn down. And I think sometimes when you have catchers playing 140 games, it sort of wears them down, in ways that bears out on the metrics. But I guess moving on from the Gomes bounce back, which is probably more of just a Gomes pairing. The other bounce back that we have to talk about is Carlos Santana. Um, Dropped from a guy who is a mid 120s weighted RC plus guy to a guy who's 110. Is the power coming back at all, or is that something that's sort of gone?
Well, one thing that I noticed, it was a game in May, and I kind of made mention of it on Twitter about it. Looked like Santana kind of had his shoulder jammed. There was a throw into the runner, and I mean, he's a guy that kind of short-limbed to play that position, so it puts him at a disadvantage anyway. But he went into the runner, and it looked like he kind of was flexing that shoulder a little bit. Then at the end of the year, we find out he had a back issue, which I believe. I mean, I don't believe Carlos Santana to be the type to make shit up, to make up excuses, and I think the power comes back. I think he's back into the 22, 23, 24 home run range. We know the on base skills are there. The BABIP's going to be an issue because he's such a pull heavy guy into that shift that, I mean, I don't think we really see a high average coming back. I think at 240, 245 would be really good from him. But I don't see why the power shouldn't come back. I mean, this is a guy that, has good power from both sides of the plate. And if that back was truly an issue last year, plus he got moved around the lineup and, there was some friction there between him and Francona that probably affected him. Not to mention, this is something that a lot of people don't talk about. I don't know if it's something that sort of affected Travis Hafner. It was probably more the elbow that did that. But Santana's wife had a kid last year. And, I mean, that screws up everything for you in terms of getting the proper rest. You're going to play with more distractions. You want to be home with the kid. So, I mean, I think from that standpoint, you have a much different, hopefully healthy Carlos Santana this year. And I think that a bounce back is certainly reasonable.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things to me, and you mentioned his BABIP, is Santana's had this sort of weird BABIP issue, where his BABIPs are actually very low in situations with runners in scoring position. And that's weird to me because he's a guy who his BABIP suppression we would expect to be one that occurs when there are no runners on base because the shift is more prevalent. But he's actually someone who last year, if I remember correctly, at the moment I don't have the number on top of my head, but his BABIPs actually struggled with runners on base and in scoring position when the shift was less prevalent, which I think is something that sort of can come back for him, that can sort of regress to a mean if there is such a mean in this situation. So I'm kind of optimistic about that aspect of improvement for
He
him.
uh, he had a 257 BABIP with the bases empty, 265 with men on, 281 with scoring position. So, it did last year seem to work out where there were less, shifting situations for the defense and the BABIP helped. I think another part of the problem for Santana is a mental thing where, he's been miscast in this lineup as this run producing guy, and he feels like that's the role that he needs to play. So that I think plays into his pull heavy nature to where he feels like, he needs to drive balls down the line, up the alley, out of the ballpark. And I think that sometimes he has a hard time overcoming that mentality with his approach. And hell, I hope he leads off because if he leads off, then he won't have that mentality. And I think that we then see the true offensive upside of a guy like Santana.
Truth teller time though, how many leadoff games do we see from Santana? If I put the over under at 20, what would you say?
Oh God, way under, way under. Francona is he's there was that article today with Pluto, and today being Friday, March 25th, that talked about Francona and understanding that he needs to mesh the analytics side with the human side, and that was something I lauded him for, over at the Cleveland Fan back when he was hired. I thought, this is a guy that's a great hire. He understands both sides of the coin, but then we didn't really see that from him. Maybe in year one a little bit, but then in years two and three, we haven't seen him really, give the analytics side the influence that it deserves. And he's not leading Carlos Santana off. It may happen very rarely, but he's happy with that Kipnis Lindor top of the order. And I mean, hey, if it keeps working, there's no reason to separate that. But at the same time, what do you do then? If you've got Kipnis, Lindor, Brantley in the top three spots, you figure Napoli's probably going to bat cleanup. Is Santana a five guy? Is he a six guy? Does that alter his approach? Because the knock on him has been that production with runners in scoring position, and if he hits fourth, fifth, sixth, he's going to have a lot more opportunities to do that than he would if he bats first or second. So, kind of a catch-22 in a way.
I think the other issue that we're going to see is he's not going to be punting. Sort of a positive outcome that you get with Santana when he's hitting fourth is that even if he walks, which is increases your run expectancy, you turn it over to a competent hitter. But I think you're going to see Santana, who's going to be rocking a 340, 350 OBP, and you're going to see him turning it over to whoever's hitting maybe sixth or seventh, and that could be Lonnie Chisenhall, that could be Marlon Byrd. Guys who are getting on base, between 29 and 31% of the time instead of 34, 35% of the time, which is a big deal and sort of a really inefficient way to play Santana in a lineup.
That is the issue. That is 100% the issue is, people get on Carlos Santana for not driving in runs, but he's doing what he's supposed to do. He's getting on base at a high clip. The problem is that the guys behind him aren't able to drive him in, aren't able to get those hits to drive in the runners in scoring position that, either moved up or stayed there because Santana walked. That's the biggest problem. And like you said, if he hits, let's say he hits fifth, for example, who's hitting behind him? You said Marlon Byrd, Yan Gomes, Lonnie Chisenhall. By and large, these are low OBP guys. So, what are you hoping for in that situation? Are you hoping a guy runs into a mistake and hits a bomb? Are you hoping that, a guy like Chisenhall bloops one in somewhere, or, Bird's got a favorable matchup in the platoon, or, some kind of thing like that? That's the issue, is that you don't maximize Santana hitting him in the middle of the order. And, that's been the most frustrating thing with regards to Francona for me over the last 3 years, is that he doesn't use Carlos Santana in the right way, and then, puts the blame on Santana when I think the blame falls on Francona's shoulders for not using one of his best offensive assets in a way where he can maximize him.
Does it scare you at all that someone who is inordinately similar to Santana is going to be put in the same lineup, and we're going to be placed with them sort of 4-5? We're going to have Mike Napoli hitting fourth and Santana hitting fifth, and both of them, probably their best tool at this point is their OBP and their walk rates. Does it kind of freak you out that we're going to have those dudes hitting 4-5, and then, as we've said before, Gomes, Chisenhall, Byrd, who are all between 290 and 320 in the OBP department?
Sure, it definitely worries me, particularly with the fact that they apparently told Mike Napoli when they signed him that he was going to play every day, despite horrific splits against righties last year. And I think a bounce back is certainly plausible for Napoli in that regard. I really don't think he'll be as bad against righties as he was last year. But, I mean, that is, the big issue is you've got two low average, high OBP guys with decent power in the middle of the order. So it's kind of a, I don't want to say boom or bust type of format, but it would be really nice to have a high average guy hitting behind them. And unfortunately, the way the lineup's set up, they're not going to have that.
So one of the really unfortunate things to me is the Indians have sort of not optimized the lineup in terms of a fit. It's something, they have these high OBP types, and then they have these sort of low contact rate types following them. I guess Chisenhall has a good contact rate. But it would be nice to have, like a Jose Ramirez, but good hitting behind Napoli, and and Santana, you need someone who can hit like 280 with a K rate around 18%. Somebody who doesn't need to hit more than 10 homers a year, but just constantly puts the ball in play, and hits for a high average. Is there somebody who could break through and do that?
It's the problem here is it's counterintuitive to do this, but if you put a guy like Jason Kipnis or Michael Brantley in the five hole, I mean, it's counterintuitive because you want your best hitters to get the most plate appearances, but those are your high average guys, and both of them actually have pretty decent walk rates and okay power. So if you did set up a lineup, something where, potentially Santana's leading off, maybe Lindor second, Napoli third, Brantley fourth, and then a Kipnis fifth, something like that. It's not something Francona is going to do, but I mean, if you can capitalize on the on base percentage by putting a couple of 300 type hitters in Brantley and Kipnis behind them, I think that would make all the difference in the world for this team. But again, as I said, the problem is, then you have Santana and Napoli getting more plate appearances than Brantley and Kipnis, and that's probably not the way that it should work out.
Yeah, the sort of sequencing balance. I mean, I think the Indians, if you set yourself up with Brantley and Kipnis in front, though, you're really ultimately costing yourself. In terms of sequencing, I think you're putting poor odds on sort of how the sequencing outcomes can occur. I guess the next question for me is, do we really think Lindor is going to last in the 2-hole the whole season? And this is not being low on Lindor. I'm very high on him, and probably higher than most in terms of how real last year was offensively. I don't think it was completely real, but I think it was very real. But do we see him sort of sliding down the order throughout the season if Brantley comes back healthy and Napoli and Santana are producing? I mean, he's at least the fifth or sixth best hitter probably if those guys are healthy and producing, right?
I think it's tough to say. I mean, I don't think that the power was legit from Lindor last year, but at the same time, I don't think a 6.2% walk rate is going to happen again this season. I mean, this is a guy that attacked the zone, has tremendous barrel skills. I mean, you can see all the raw talent. I don't have to go into all that, but I think he walks more this year. And if you trade some of that power for walking more, it's not ideal, I guess, but because he's hitting in the two hole, if he brings that walk rate up to around 8%, continues to have a strikeout rate in the 15, 16, 17% range, with his barrel quality, his speed, I mean, he could very well be a 330 BABIP guy with a, league average or better walk rate, 10 home runs, some kind of thing like that. And that would be with some minor regression in some of these categories. So frankly, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, this kid understands the game. He knows the game. He's a very, very smart player, and that was one of the things, there was a quote from Francona. I talked a little bit about this on direct message with August Fagerstrom, was Francona said something about how Lindor was bunting early in the game to get a better read on a pitcher's stuff. And obviously, everybody that follows me on Twitter or everybody that understands run expectancy knows that bunting early in a game is really stupid. But if there's a method to the madness from Lindor, while I don't really want to see him do it, I guess I do appreciate the way that he's trying to learn Major League pitching, adjust to Major League pitching. So while I hate the idea, I appreciate the way that he goes about his business. And I think because of that, he can survive as a top of the order hitter, particularly if that walk rate comes up.
Yeah, I think as we see the BABIP progress, I would bet that the walk rate sort of balances out in terms of OBP. I don't think the OBP moves that much. I actually have sort of weird thoughts on his power. And I'll be interested to see over the next couple of years. I think one of the really interesting things to me is he reminds me a lot of Michael Brantley in a lot of ways from the left-handed side of the plate. He has that tremendous bat head control. He makes really good contact consistently. His exit velocity data is really solid. And I think Brantley has done something, really smart in terms of taking advantage of a right field porch with his dominant side platoon, of really sort of picking on that porch and pulling balls with authority. And I think Lindor's, has the bat head control to do that. He has the intellect to do that. I wouldn't be surprised to see Lindor sort of sit in the 12 to 15, maybe a little bit higher than that home run power, just because I really like the way his bat head control fits, and I love the way the right field porch sort of sits for him. for the next couple of years. So I don't know. I'm weirdly optimistic about a little of that power staying, not all of it.
I think that's reasonable. I mean, I think the Brantley parallel is a good one because Michael Brantley is not a guy that, has prolific power. He's kind of, um, he's sort of the mold of like a Bobby Abreu or a Garrett Anderson type, where they generate power by having, a really level swing plane, good bat speed. And the thing about Brantley is that, you talked about, he made that adjustment to turn on the inside pitch and really start to punish it. And, that's what we saw from Lindor. I mean, when Lindor hit his balls out, it was from, being quick on the inner half of the plate to a point almost, cheating on the inner half of the plate. And, I have no problem with that. I mean, because the nice thing about guys like that is if they take a shot, they're guessing inner half, they kind of take away the outer half, they're looking to turn on a ball. If they rip it foul or, some kind of thing like that, they still have the back control to go out there and hit a ball back up the middle or slap one the other way. It's not like some of these other guys where, they cheat on a ball, they hit a ball 440 feet foul, and then you know that they're screwed. Lindor and Brantley are two guys that can take that shot at least once a plate appearance, possibly twice a plate appearance, because they have such good contact skills.
Yeah, I love it. I love Lindor's ability to sort of barrel the ball to each field. And I think that's a great point. I think that he's someone who can cheat early in a count and really take advantage. I think one of the things Brantley did really well was he started taking advantage when he was up 2-0, 3-1 in terms of cordoning off and pulling the inside fastball. And I think Lindor can do that too. And I think Lindor is the sort of person who's smart enough to make that adjustment and work with someone to make that adjustment. So I think that you could, and I'm very, very optimistic about sort of his power stabilizing over the next couple of years. I don't think this is fraudulent. I
You know what's
guess
really
we have to
fascinating
look.
about Lindor here? Of his 12 home runs last year, three of them came in full counts. Two of them were on the second pitch. Well, actually, three of them were on the second pitch, and two of them were on the first pitch. So I think that's kind of what we're talking about is, in full counts, he knows he's getting a fastball, and early in the count, he's probably getting fastballs as well. So, that's what I want to see. I want to see the adjustment when pitchers kind of work him backwards a little bit, if that is something that they do this year. That's where I think the power sags a little bit this season. But then I think, down the road, I mean, we talked about it. He's such a smart baseball player that he'll know when to pick and choose his spots. And you know what? It doesn't hurt that he's got a guy like Michael Brantley who has that similar offensive makeup, to where he can go back to him after a plate appearance and go, hey, what did you see? What are you, expecting when we face this guy again? And that's the thing. He's eager to learn. That's where the makeup comes in, where he's a guy that wants to get better. He's got all the raw talent, but he's got the makeup as well. And that's why he can elevate all of his tools.
I think that's the crazy thing, and I think a lot of times we get really blinded, especially with guys like Lindor. I mean, Lindor is this guy with sort of exceptional talent, and he's 22 years old, and he's made it to the big leagues. And people sort of want to confine what his skill set and what his athleticism are going to feed into for the next 6-7 years. And really, his body is just past its growing stage. I mean, this is a guy who still is adding muscle to his body. This is a guy who's still sort of adapting. And I think confining him to someone who isn't going to, maybe perch 15 to 18 a year is something that's kind of foolish to do and not something I would do this early in his career. Who's the next dude who, Lindor's someone who I think is very popular to talk about as a regression candidate. And I guess his double play partner is similarly. Kipnis has sort of had an atrocious 2014. A lot of it was tied to injury. Great 2013, great 2015. Is it right to expect significant regression from him? What can we expect from Kipnis in 2016?
Kipnis is a tough one for me. I mean, you read some of the things at Fangraphs about aging curves and whatnot, and second base is the one that, the last time I had read a really good piece over there at Fangraphs, second base was the one that ages the quickest. And Jason Kipnis will be 29 the day before opening day. So, this is a guy where we may be starting to exit his prime. The 356 BABIP, probably not sustainable, but, I mean, I think it's really interesting to watch him and watch his approach because, he's another one of these guys that finds a way to use the whole field. He's got very good contact skills. He does strike out a little bit because he's a little bit susceptible to the high fastball. But I mean, yeah, maybe you see the 303 average go down to 290. You see the OBP drop maybe 15 points into the 355 type of range, that area. But at the same time, I think the power comes back a little bit more this year because I think that he's a guy that, was getting accustomed to that leadoff spot and didn't really take a whole lot of chances to hit the ball out of the ballpark. I think he climbs back over 10 this year if he stays healthy. And I also think he may run a little bit more this year. Only 12 bags last year, 22 the year before, 30 and 31 before that. I think you see him up in that 15 to 18 range on the bases because, I think what you're going to find this year, and at least I hope that this is the case, is as opposed to straight bunting with Lindor, I think Lindor with his bat control is an ideal hit and run candidate, and Kipnis may get some extra bases out of that.
Kipnis worries me so much. I think we've probably seen the best season we're going to see from Kipnis, and that's not that hard to say. I think the biggest concern for me is going to be as that body ages, and as you mentioned, aging curves. I'm going to be really curious to see how his defense ages. This is a guy who's sort of busted his butt off to be somewhere around league average, and I think as his speed, which is already kind of iffy, though he utilizes his speed like few others do in terms of on the base paths. But I'm really concerned about how that defense ages over the next couple of years. And I think it could end up meaning a position change in the not so near future, depending on how bad it can get. But I certainly wouldn't want him to hear that because I'm sure he'd beat the hell out of me.
The thing about Kipnis, though, is and this is going to sound really cliche and it's not necessarily quantifiable, so it kind of goes against everything I believe. But, this is a guy that doesn't give at bats away. I mean, for what he may lack in terms of, raw tools, this is a guy that really battles when he gets in the box. And I give him a lot of credit for that. And, I think that he's a guy that can handle velocity. I mean, of course, we're seeing velocity the highest it's ever been in Major League Baseball. I think because of that, he's a guy that as long as he's healthy, has a higher floor than most second basemen because he doesn't go up there and give himself away early in the count. It's not a great walk rate. It's a little bit above league average, but he goes up there and battles, and there's something to be said about that. Like I said, it's not necessarily quantifiable, but I think I'm certainly more optimistic on Kipnis than you are, and I think part of your pessimism on Kipnis is because you want Jose Ramirez to work out so bad.
I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's fair at all. But no, I think one of the most impressive things I've seen over the past couple of years is how Kipnis adapted to the leadoff spot last year. I think you saw him sell out power for an ability to get on base for a batting average and OBP that was really valuable for the Indians. He was a great table setter in 2015, and he adapted to a new role, and he did it really well. And we saw him use the whole field more to do it. And I think that's something that's really laudable. And I was really impressed by it. I didn't expect Kipnis to make those sort of changes, and he did them quickly and seamlessly. And I mean, ultimately, if he doesn't do that, that offense would have been an absolute pigsty last year. I think it's incredible how much he sort of stabilized that offense almost on his own at the top.
I think, though, your concerns are merited. I mean, the second half stuff it's very real. I mean, the strikeout rate jumped last year. The walk rate crashed. All of his numbers across the board really went down in the second half. So I think that from that standpoint, I mean, we are talking about a guy who has inflated his career offensive numbers because of playing really well in the first half. So that I think is a legitimate concern. And I mean, I guess that's where Jose Ramirez comes in. I mean, do you feel like if Kipnis, let's say you limit Kipnis to 80 games in the first half, 75 games in the first half, something like that, is this just a mental second half thing, or is this hey, he wears down, so if we can sort of, go with the marathon versus sprint approach for him, he can be sustainably good throughout the year?
I don't know. I don't know if you just want to nuke all his value early in the season while you can, or if you feel like you can protect it. One of the things that's really hard with Kipnis, though, is I think the ideal thing would be to sort of protect him at DH. But the Indians have just, with the Brantley injury, with Napoli and Santana, and then I guess with Bird in the fold, It's really hard to sort of imagine the Indians sitting, playing Kipnis at DH 10 to 15 games and playing Jose Ramirez so that Kipnis only has to play like 130 games in the field, which I think is really unfortunate. I think that would have, sort of protected him, and maybe we would have seen, whether or not protecting him means a better second half. But predicting, I think it's so hard to sort of isolate why these second down breakdowns occur. But I think as someone who seems like a really high use player in terms of he seems to be dirty in the way that he gives up his body frequently. He plays very hard. I think that he wears down more than most, and I think protecting him would be key. I just don't know how you do it at this point, other than sitting him, and his bat is way too important to sort of sit him too frequently.
Yeah, and that kind of gives merit to what you're talking about with regards to a position change. And I don't know if that's on the organization's radar. I mean, I guess if you see something more from Jose Ramirez at the big league level, you can start to consider it. But again, you have to create playing time for Jose Ramirez. That's kind of the problem now is, you can't set the wheels in motion to move Kipnis to left field or some kind of thing like that without seeing that Jose Ramirez, can be a bona fide starting second baseman in Major League Baseball. So, I agree. They're kind of in a tough spot with Kipnis, and the problem with that is that, as you said, he's such a valuable hitter that if he wears down, then what can you do? That's the problem. You can't take him out of the lineup. And if he's performing at below league average, which last year in the second half, a 96 weighted runs created plus, that's well below league average, particularly compared to his first half. I don't know what that balance is.
He's also not a dude where you could get really aggressive with Jose Ramirez, sort of like say you're up, 6-2 in the seventh inning and you want to go just to Ramirez as a defensive replacement and just get Kipnis out of there to, protect his body. Kipnis is not a guy that I would think that you would sit down and he'd be willing to do that. I just think Kipnis is a guy who loves to be in the game. He's intense. And I don't see Kipnis wearing that well. He's someone who's a little too fiery to sort of wear the I'm getting defensively replaced late in games mode, even if it is to protect his body, which I think makes it even harder to sort of do that. On the other hand, I have the same worry where I don't think we're going to know. I'm obviously far too optimistic on Jose Ramirez, but I don't think we're really going to know whether he's a legit league starter ever unless Kipnis goes out and misses a serious chunk of time. I think it's so hard to get a feel for that, even if I think his defense is plus at second base. So I don't really know. And how would you move Kipnis long term to the outfield? I mean, you have the corners are sort of full, correct? I mean, we have Brantley in left. Left is the only position that sort of makes sense to me with Kipnis. I think his arm is pretty weak. And then, right field is probably going to be filled by Zimmer or Frazier, as I don't really think they're center field types, though I could be wrong. I mean, is there a place to go with Kipnis in the outfield even?
Yeah, I don't know. And the issue is that you're locked into Kipnis through 2019, and this is a guy that, has worn down on a season by season basis in the second half. What do you start to get at the end of that deal when he's, over 30? That's very difficult because, as you said, when are you going to find out about Jose Ramirez? He's obviously not going to play short unless something happens to Lindor. Do you go that Ben Zobrist type role with him and sort of move him around and get him, 110 games playing in a bunch of different positions? I don't really know if that's the course of action that the Indians want to take with him at this point. So, I don't know what you do with Jose Ramirez. That's why I've talked about him as a guy I'd like to see them trade because I think he has more intrinsic value on the trade market than he would in this organization because there's just not really a whole lot of plate appearances for him. The thing about Brantley is, you got a club option for 18, so in 2 years he's gone. So if you wanted to use Kipnis in 2019 in the outfield, you could presumably find a way to do that. But, also at the same time, I mean, anybody talking about a position change with Brantley, I think that's ludicrous because why not use up his option? Because you're clearly not giving him the 20 million he's going to command after 2018. So, just wear all these guys down. You wear down a Brantley, you wear down a Kipnis, you hope that they make it through the end of their contracts with the Indians, and let somebody else deal with it after the fact.
I have a counter proposal. So what if we find out that Jose Ramirez is better offensively than we think, and we accept the presupposition that he's an above average defender at second base? So say J-Ram posts like 95 weighted RC plus this year, and we know that he's a good defender at second, which is like 2.5 to 3 WAR player. You have Kipnis, who would be turning 30 next year. His body's wearing down. His contract is escalating in expense, but it's still favorable if you're a larger market team. Does the smart operational sort of move turn Kipnis into an asset while he's still an asset, and you just commit to Jose Ramirez? And this is obviously a hugely sort of complex hypothetical, which requires Ramirez showing something offensively, which is not incredibly likely to happen, though I'm optimistic. I mean, is that a possibility?
It's a possibility from an analytics standpoint, but the problem here is that, it's a much bigger picture you have to consider. I mean, Jason Kipnis has morphed into one of the leaders of this team. And, as much as people don't want to embrace that, and I'm certainly one of them because, I'm so strictly based in the analytics side that, I don't really care about player feelings. I don't know any of these guys. It doesn't really cross my mind. For me, it's a results business. It's not a people business in any way, shape, or form for me. But I also recognize Kipnis's importance to the organization, to the franchise, to the clubhouse, to the branding, to the PR, to all of that. I think that that's a really tough sell. I mean, even if it makes sense, because, J Ram, it's ridiculous to think this kid's only 23 years old. So there's plenty of time left for him. But the issue is, would it be a smart baseball move? Maybe. But in the grand scheme of things, it's hard to see Kipnis not playing out the length of this deal.
This is where I kind of wonder where the Indians are in this market, in the Cleveland market at this point. I mean, how detrimental can dealing a guy like Kipnis be to this fan base? And I absolutely understand where you're coming from, and I think it's a really valid point, and I think it's why what I suggested will never happen. But I ultimately wonder how much dealing a Kipnis really can adversely affect this fan base at this point in terms of loyalty. Um, we've moved Lee and Sabathia, and I think a lot of people walked away when that happened. Are we going to walk away? Are we going to have walkaways because of a Kipnis deal, or is it just more bad branding from this front office that it can't sort of survive?
I, you know this as well as I do. It's different when you move an impending free agent, a guy that you have absolutely no chance to sign. If you move Jason, let's say you move Jason Kipnis with 2 years left on his deal plus a 2020 option, then that becomes a little bit different. I mean, there are segments of the fan base, as ignorant as some of them may be in a lot of ways, that understand that, you have to trade impending free agents when you're in this market. You're not giving Cliff Lee 25 million a year. You're not giving CC Sabathia 20 million a year. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to give Michael Brantley 20 million a year, which is going to be a really sad day after that 2018 season. But I mean, that's just how it goes. For Kipnis, though, because he's signed longer term at what theoretically should be a pretty reasonable deal. I mean, he's already adding surplus value here in these cheaper years that should balance out the later years when he's getting paid. He makes almost 15 in 2019, almost 14 in 2018. You've gotten the value out of that deal, or at least, with a good season this year, you pretty much will. So there's that aspect of it, but it's so much easier for people to get over when it is an impending free agent as opposed to a core player that is signed for several years at even in this market is a fairly reasonable number.
Yeah, and I think Kipnis has a sort of Midwestern. He has a very sort of blue collar vibe that I think dealing him would be incredibly hard for the front office to
He
handle.
he's relatable.
He is. He seems like a guy who he's like a guy I would never want to go to a bar and hang out with, but also he seems very relatable to Cleveland. So I'll leave that where it stands, I guess. But so those are our regression candidates and sort of our bounce back. Is there anybody you think that's going to take a leap forward this year? Like who's the dude that's going to leap off the charts?
Well, the obvious answer right now would be Cody Anderson, given the increased velocity. I mean, that kid's got a workhorse frame to begin with, and now that he really strengthened it, I think it's really interesting to look at the way that off seasons line up for guys because you look at a guy like Mike Napoli, for example, who all of last off season he was rehabbing something or dealing with something. This off season he was able to train, and that's why I'm a lot more bullish on a guy like him because I feel like he has this ability to have a bounce back year. And for Cody Anderson, he goes through the grind of part of a major league season, has that oblique issue at the end of the year, and realizes, you know what, maybe I need to strengthen my core. Maybe I need to strengthen my lower half. And a lot of velocity is generated from that standpoint. And then for Cody Anderson to grow into his body and then build on it, I mean, you really got to like that. So I think obviously, with some of the buzz about him with the velocity gains, he's a guy that could really take that step forward. And I think another guy that can take that big step forward this year, and this is really an easy guy to throw out, is Danny Salazar. I mean, we saw that curveball that was a work in progress last year. You know that he refined it in the offseason. I mean, this is a guy that studies pitch FX data. He's kind of attached himself to Trevor Bauer a little bit, one of the few people in the clubhouse, I presume, that has done that. And I mean, the split change is just nasty. I mean, it's an absurd pitch. The fastball life is there. The curveball, I don't know if it is something that can improve his fastball command, because when you kind of slow it down a little bit, simplify your delivery to get the good movement on that curveball, maybe it helps smooth out everything for him. I don't know. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert on pitching mechanics. I'm certainly not the right person to throw out a generalization like that, but it's just something I kind of wonder about. And I mean, this is a guy, if he lowers that home run rate, I mean, he's up there with Carrasco and Kluber in terms of FIP and xFIP. And I mean, that's a really, really special combination for a guy like Salazar. So I think he and Cody Anderson could take big steps forward this season.
Yeah, I know I've semi jokingly asked you about Cy Young odds for Salazar, but I absolutely love his stuff. And the curveball. The really interesting thing is the curveball doesn't have to be particularly special. I think in terms of game theory, that curveball just has to play up enough, and the usage rate has to sort of increase enough, just to make it a little bit more challenging on right-handed hitters. And I really expect him to do that. I think it was a pitch that was high quality in terms of its break and what he showed, in terms of movement and spin rate. And so watching it develop this year in terms of him being able to harness it, him having a spring to work on actually controlling it inside and outside the strike zone is a big deal. I think how he used it when he was learning it in season alone was pretty impressive. So with a full off season, I'm really optimistic about that. The Anderson thing to me is really interesting. The velocity leap is a huge deal, but we're still, to me, I'm getting the vibe that we're still a year away with this sort of clicking. We have a huge velocity leap, which is awesome and plays up his whole arsenal. And we have somebody tinkering with a curveball, and it looks like it's added some depth to it. But that second part of the arsenal, the changeup, which is kind of a meh pitch, and the curveball, which he hasn't really mastered yet, those have to leap before we really get too excited, right?
It depends. I mean, it depends on your level of excitement. I mean, this guy would be your fifth starter behind Trevor Bauer and, of course, the big three. So, how good do you need it to be? I mean, in terms of a big leap, we're talking about a guy that had, 3.05 ERA because he had a really good BABIP against. I mean, he got very fortunate defensively. But, I mean, in terms of a big leap for a fifth starter, if that 427 FIP becomes 380, 375, if that xFIP goes from 458 to 390, 385, something like that, I think that when you talk big leap, you have to. I mean, it's not a big leap like Salazar, who could go from being a quality middle of the rotation guy to a Cy Young guy. Anderson goes from a sixth or seventh starter to a guy that you could conceivably consider a fourth. I think that's I think you just have to keep it in the proper perspective of what a big leap means for each specific player.
So let's project that. I mean, do you think 150 innings he can post a 380 FIP this year? I mean, I think that's pretty aggressive, which I like. And also the second thing is, do we, in terms of the fastball velocity, do we think it can sort of improve that ground ball rate? I'm intrigued by what it's going to affect in terms of his sort of run and sink on that fastball. As we know, Anderson's a guy who sort of progressed through the system as a ground ball reliant guy, which fits really well with having Francisco Lindor and Uribe and Urshela and Kipnis and Napoli on the infield. I mean, is this an easier leap to make than we think?
I mean, it could be. I think what I really want to know, I mean, when you look at the article that Jeff Sullivan wrote over at Fangraphs about Anderson and the velocity leap on May 22nd, didn't really mention anything outside of the fastball velocity. So I want to know, has the changeup velocity gone up as well? Because for Anderson, if you create more separation, I mean, last year by PitchFX data, he was 92 with the fastball, 83.6 with the change. If you go 94 to 83 or 94 to 84, I mean that's a pretty big difference. I mean that's why fastball velocity can play up in Arsenal because you create more separation in terms of pitch speeds, and that's where you can get hitters, out in front on the change, particularly if it looks like the fastball coming out, and that's where you see the ground ball rate increase. That's where you see, an infield fly ball increase, which won't happen for him because it was 15% last year. That'll probably go down a little bit. But you do start to see weaker contact when you create more separation and velocity. So if Anderson's fastball goes up while keeping the secondary stuff, maybe with minor increases, then that's where I think you can see, that increase in ground ball rate. And of course, as you well know, an increase in ground ball rate with this infield defense can really, really help a guy.
Absolutely. I don't want to keep you on too much longer. I know you have a little bit of a commitment here at 10:30, so we're going to wrap it up. Thanks for coming on, Adam. That's my professional close. I'm going to be as professional as possible. That was Adam Burke. He's very insightful, much more insightful than I am. This is Mike Hattery for the Everybody Hates Cleveland podcast. Have a good night.